Long before anyone could record sound, music was already part of human life.
The oldest widely accepted instruments that we've found are bone and ivory flutes, dating back roughly 40,000 years.
And while voices, clapping, and rhythms don't exactly fossilize, researchers still think that music has been with us since the very beginning.
For most of history, songs lived in memory, passed down from person to person, and then eventually written down as notation.
But the ability to actually capture sound itself is much more recent.
So let's skip ahead to the 1800s, where we're considering more modern times. Even then, music was still fleeting.
Yeah.
Unless you lived in a household that happened to have a piano, or you knew someone that had an instrument that they played for you, listening to music wasn't a passive experience as it is now. You had to actively go out and seek it. And for a lot of people, it was still considered a luxury to some degree and something they only really got to experience maybe weekly at a church or some sort of religious type event.
This all changed very quickly.
In the 1850s, a French inventor named Édouard-léon Scott de Martinville created an invention called the Phonautograph. He was able to capture recorded sound onto soot-covered paper.
Yeah, the phonograph is similar in nature to the seismograph. The seismograph captures vibrations from the ground. This was very similar, but instead of the ground, it was capturing the air pressure.
Yeah.
The air pressure movement. And that's really all that sound is. It's air pressure hitting your eardrums at a certain amount of hertz. You know, for example, an A440 is hitting your eardrum at 440 hertz per second, which is 1 hertz and 1 up and down. So it's just like vibrating super fast. So that's what it did. It basically captured the air pressure of the sound, and it was basically drawing it onto soot-covered paper.
Yep.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because it was being drawn onto soot-covered paper, there was no way to play this music back.
It's not saying anything.
I can't hear anything.
I'm covered in soot.
Then, in 2008, researchers did something super cool. They took Scott's visual waveform and they converted it back into sound. And this was not just some random experiment. This was by researchers and archivists and audio historians. There was a whole group of people that came together to make this happen. They used modern image to sound methods to interpret the original soot-covered drawing.
So one of the earliest recognizable recordings of a human voice comes from 1860. When Édouard-léon Scott used his phonautograph to capture someone, probably himself, singing the opening of Au clair de la lune. Scott identified the recording as Au clair de la lune. More specifically, his notes labeled it as the song being sung with a tuning fork writing at the same time. So the speed and pitch could be measured. So it could be calibrated afterwards. So when I heard Au clair de la lune, I immediately thought Debussy. I was like, oh, that's Clair de Lune. But it wasn't. After I looked, it's very similar titling. Clair de la Lune is an old French folk kid song. Debussy wasn't even alive yet.
Oh, he wasn't even born yet?
No, he wasn't even born yet. But funny enough, ironically, he ended up using Clair de la Lune, that melody, in another one of his songs called Pierrot.
But not Clair de Lune.
But not Clair de Lune. It's just a random, ironic, funny little thing.
What's really kind of wild to think about is how ordinary of a snippet this was. It was the beginning of an old French folk song. And what it's become now is one of the earliest recorded voices that we have.
It's so cool.
And it's awesome.
And this is what it sounds like.
So about 17 years later or so in 1877, Thomas Edison arrives with the phonograph. And the phonograph has the ability to not just capture sound, but to also play back that captured sound. And he did that by the sound was actually engraved onto these cylinder discs, these rotating cylinder discs, and then the disc could be played back.
It's so cool. If you ever look at these, it has the same concept of a record player.
This is the moment that pushes the era of recorded music forward. Like, it's like, here we are, here we go. Fun fact, Thomas Edison had all sorts of ideas for what he could do with recorded sound. Everything from teaching abilities to making audiobooks for blind people.
Recording dialect to make sure that the way you pronounce words, kind of like a record of
Yeah,
that.
and like different languages. Yep.
And even things like reminders to tell you to do certain things. Right away. I mean, that speaks to Thomas Edison's brain. You know, it's like, oh, we have this thing. What can we do with it?
Yeah, not just his invention, though, brain, but also like marketing brain. Like, hey, how can we like make money off this?
Yeah.
Like a lot of it. Like,
talk about being way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
You know, he was good like that.
Yeah.
He was good like that.
Quick note about these cylinders, because these cylinders were kind of a pain, like kind of a big pain. So early cylinders were made out of like emulsified waxes, like a few different types of wax. They were brittle, they were delicate, they were awkward to transport. They could also grow things like fungus and mold. And antique, they're antique ones now, and you can find online ways that people can get rid of the mold on these old these old cylinders.
Yeah, if there's YouTube videos about how to remove the mold
How to
from
remove
your
mold
cylinders.
from Edison cylinders. Yeah,
That's gotta be a thing.
Yeah. So they weren't great. They could also only hold about 2 to 2.5 minutes of a song. So welcome to your first hit clip experience. Hit clips. But of course, as it does, technology evolves. And with it, they started using better materials to make stronger cylinders. And then also they had a new casting process called gold molding, which there was no gold in the cylinders. They were not that fancy, but the casting molds that they used did have gold in them, and they were stronger. So they started casting these cylinders, which then they were able to mass produce.
Yep, mass production. Here we go.
So here we go.
Just to anchor all of this in time, this all happened around when the modern world started to show up.
Yeah.
Things like telephones were becoming a real thing. Between around 1900 and 1910, the number of phones in the Bell system jumped up from about 600,000, which is a lot.
Yeah.
But to almost 6 million.
That's a lot of growth.
Yeah.
In 1903, the Wright brothers make their first flight.
In the early 1900s, movie theaters started taking off.
And by 1908, the Model T appears.
But at the same time, American homes still don't have electricity. Most of them don't. So these phonographs, being mechanical, spring-round machines, really matter. You could have recorded music in your home before your home even had electric lights. And that's the world cylinders grew up in.
But, as with everything in history, there are some downsides.
So believe it or not, the music industry has problems. And guess what? They actually started right there.
It's true.
So once mass production started to happen,
Yeah.
this is where all of a sudden there is this separation from the performer to the medium of music being performed or played. So the performer only needs to perform it once.
Right.
And then it becomes a product that someone else has the ownership over. Do you see a little bit of an issue here?
Yeah, not just that, but for people that are composers of said music, now you could have a company hire a musician, record their music, and then sell it without the composer of the music even knowing off the bat or having any control over who is making their music and selling it to other people.
Yeah, and back then there's not the interconnection of the internet. Things could happen 4 doors down and you wouldn't really know what's going on. And then not to mention the quality of this. You have a composer or a performer that performs into this recorder and it doesn't sound great, but now that's their representation of who they are as a composer or a performer. There's a lot of issues here.
There's a lot of issues here. And there was one person who really spearheaded and who was not afraid to bring this issue to Congress, and that was John Philip Sousa.
Mr. John Philip Sousa.
The copyright matters for the rights of the composers and the musicians when it came to this. Sousa had already been fighting for a while, and at some point he penned an article about recorded music. So here we have the John Philip Sousa article that he wrote called The Menace of Mechanical Music. The first kind of half or so of this was more philosophical in nature. If you want to read the whole thing, we'll link it in the description. But the second half, he talks about a joint committee meeting in Congress that he sat in on and some of the discussions around composers being completely unprotected under the present copyright laws. He noted that phonograph and record manufacturers seem to have no respect for musicians or composers at all. In one part, Sousa says, and I quote, "Asked if he claimed the right to take one of my compositions and use it in connection with his mechanical device without compensation to myself, his unselfish reply was,
'Under the Constitution and all the laws of the land, I say yes, decidedly.'
Asked if he was not protected in his patents, his answer was promptly in the affirmative, but he seemed wholly unable to grasp the proposition that a composer should ask for similar protections on his creative work." So it's like people can agree how important music is for humans, but we refuse to ever protect the ones that are making the music. That makes me so angry. It's so obnoxious. And it started right as music started being recorded. Like, we never had a chance. These were not the ramblings of like a crazy old man who, hates technology. Like, he saw what this could do to musicians and wanted to get protections for musicians, for himself and for others.
Right away. Get them in place. Because the runaway is fast.
Yeah.
Here we have an issue of the Edison Photograph Monthly, which was published specifically for people working in the phonograph trade. I want to go through a few of these articles, talk about what they actually meant, and look at some of the language and terminology the industry was using at the time. So one of the first sections says, "This increase was not only equaled on time, but owing to the remarkably increased demand for goods, it was exceeded week after week until in the week ending December 17th, the output was more than 100% greater than that of any week in September. In just a few months, Edison more than doubled weekly production. Recording music was becoming an industry faster than the laws could protect the people who wrote and performed it.
We are strong advocates of and firm believers in the advisability of all dealers carrying a complete stock of all domestic selections cataloged. You may be successful without all of them, but you are certain to be more successful if you have them." Music was being treated as inventory, mass-produced titles that dealers were expected to stock and sell like any other product. It shows how quickly control of music was shifting towards manufacturers, catalogs, and retailers. This list of February records comprises 9 instrumental and 16 vocal selections. Talking about the latest composition of Sousa's at the time, it says, "When we made this record, the composition had been heard in New York only 10 days, but it had already caught on and has since been rapidly climbing into popularity. Edison was releasing 25 new cylinders in a single month, and it could turn a newly heard Sousa composition into a commercial product within 10 days. The article never says whether Sousa approved the recording or received anything from it. That's exactly how quickly the business was racing ahead of the composer."
If you pause right now and read this whole paragraph, I want you to take note of who Edison credits for his success. He credits company officers, employees, jobbers, and dealers. The composers and performers whose music filled those cylinders are not mentioned once.
I'm not going to read this passage verbatim because its description of the indigenous performers is openly racist and dehumanizing. But basically, a telegraph operator recorded 3 indigenous men performing and mailed the cylinder to Edison's foreign department. Among those degrading descriptions, there is no mention of permission, payment, or ownership. Their performance was taken out of their community and sent across the world as material for a commercial company.
At the bottom, it says, "Unfortunately, the record was broken," and maybe that was for the better.
I would think so. On page 6 is given a list of 222 record titles that will be omitted from all future editions of the record catalogs. The molds of these records are not in condition for good work, and as the demand for these selections is not sufficient to warrant the expense of making new masters and molds, it has been decided to discontinue their manufacture. This clearly shows who controlled the recorded work's future. The company decided whether a performance remained available or disappeared from circulation. There is no mention of consulting the composers or performers.
And this kind of thing just keeps going. Page after page, Edison talks about factories, dealers, catalogs, advertising, patents, prices, and inventory. Composers and performers are usually mentioned only when their names help identify the product. That imbalance is the real story here. Recorded music had stopped just being a way to preserve a performance. It had become an industry that could reproduce, market, alter, and even discontinue someone's work, with the creators pushed further and further from the center of it. This is where the music business began to run away from the musicians. So something we haven't really talked about is the piano roll. This was another aspect of recorded music, but really what it was doing was making the piano itself, a player piano, play the song of the composer's, doings. So this was another thing that John Sousa was incredibly, worried about. And a lot of his fear of like people not wanting to play anymore because a machine can play your music came from that as well.
Yep.
But now think about this. Say you're a composer and you wrote this song and they made a piano roll out of it, and then they make mass productions of that, and now your song is playing in all the saloons. I feel like it's saloons. It's always a saloon in my mind. They're all playing everywhere and you're not. So suddenly you're not getting paid for the performances of playing at all the places, and chances are they bought the piano roll off of you for a certain amount of money, and then that company is selling it for a certain amount of money, probably more, to all of these performance places with player pianos. So in 1908,
yes,
there was a ruling against the musicians. These are the court's exact words. These perforated rolls are part of a machine when duly applied and properly operated in connection with the mechanism to which they are adapted, produce musical tones in harmonious combination. But we cannot think that they are copies within the meaning of the Copyright Act. It may be true that the use of these perforated rolls, in the absence of statutory protection, enables the manufacturers thereof to enjoy the use of musical compositions for which they pay no value. But such considerations properly address themselves to the legislative and not to the judicial branch of the government. Yeah.
That sucks.
So right away, they're just like, nah.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
There was a little bit of a victory in the end. It wasn't a 100% victory, but the Copyright Act of 1909 created the mechanical royalty. So basically, composers and publishers gained a right to be paid when their music was mechanically reproduced on things like piano rolls and records. But it was a compromise. Once a song was allowed to be mechanically reproduced, other companies could also use it as long as they paid the statutory royalty.
Yeah.
So it's better than nothing.
Better than nothing, but also still messy right off the bat.
Yeah.
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 And it always seems throughout history, and starting right here, that the intent wasn't for making the musician's life better.
No.
It was always like, how can we make more money off of them? And, lawmakers and creative musicians are two different types of people.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm sure there's musicians who are legal people too. But in that scenario, it always feels like they're trying to take advantage of the people who don't know the law quite well. And especially back then, and especially now, you have musicians who are just studying music their whole life. And then you got, lawmakers who are studying lawmaking their whole life.
And then you have the record company, which is trying to make as much money as physically, humanly possible at all times.
Right. So how do we make the verbiage sound like it's good for the musician so the musicians can be like, oh, cool. But then in fine print, and, I know this is kind of going off the rails a little bit, but it started right here.
Yeah.
It started right here.
As soon as music could be recorded, there were people trying to take advantage of musicians. Like,
Immediately.
Just immediately.
Immediately. So 1877, the phonograph came out and the cylinders were made and the piano rolls were being made as well. And it took about 35 years for the first law to help us out, help the musicians out. And it wasn't perfect even.
No.
And it doesn't get any better.
No.
So with all this in mind, the idea of a machine playing your music, the phonograph playing the music, the piano rolls playing your music, that thought was intense of, well, is it real music if a machine is playing the music, right? And that was very intense then, and it's very intense now. So there is this fine line of what decides if music is real or not.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a whole podcast about that, and we'll be doing that very shortly. But also, there is going to be part 2 of the history of recorded music. And what is it going to be about?
Vinyl, baby.
We got vinyl coming up. So thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next one, and we will see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Oh, bye.